Divergent. Y'all get strapped in for this one because I have opinions. Recently, I did a poll and I asked you guys what you guys would like me to cover next as a fantasy series, and the majority of you voted Divergent. So I got to it and I rewatched all the films. When I was watching the films, I never really had a problem with Abnegation or any of the factions as a whole. I mean, I did think the idea was quite arbitrary, but I always thought, okay, this is definitely a means to an end for sure. My first impression of Abnegation was just, first of all, the clothes were ugly, but fine, whatever. The weirdness for not looking in mirrors, and the fact that they were just very much focused on community and selflessness, the rejection of individuality and the exception of collectivity. And I thought, okay, that's not really for me, but honestly, love this for you, babes. And if you guys chose this life, amazing. Until I listened to the books and I realized that Abnegation not only has a lot of cult-like allegory within its making, and of course this can be argued for a lot of other factions, but Abnegation is a problematic faction and it needs to be discussed. And in my personal opinion, Abnegation's quote-unquote ideals for selflessness and their values is full of virtue signaling and a bunch of hypocrisy. Whew. This might be a controversial video, but y'all, let's get strapped in. It's first of all important to note that the factions were created after a supposed war. Trish says, in quote, "Decades ago, our ancestors realized that it is not political ideology, religious belief, race, or nationalism that is to blame for a warring world. Rather, they determined that it was the fault of human personality, of humankind's inclination towards evil, and its many forms. So they decided to divide into 5 factions that sought to eradicate those qualities that they believed were responsible for the world's disarray. Working together, these 5 factions have lived in peace for many years, each contributing to a different sector of society in our factions. In our factions, we find meaning, we find purpose, and we find life." This in itself is very controversial on its own, but I'm not really discussing the pitfalls of the ideas of the factions, but rather the factions themselves, right? So the Abnegation faction was formed by the people who blamed selfishness for human nature's errors and selfishness as a result of a warring world. Don't get me wrong, I understand the use of abnegation. Abnegation in one's life can be helpful towards others. The problem is the extremities of how abnegation is as a faction. But before we get into my main points, let's look at their main values and manifesto so you can fully see what I mean. They have a lot of values, and if I was to go over them, we'd be here for almost an hour, but let me just go over a few. The word abnegation itself means the action of renouncing or rejecting something, or the action of self-denial. And in the faction of abnegation, they emphasize action rather than identity. Most of their teachings involved the how of behavior and very little of the why, and not to explain the faction to outsiders or even members. Every faction norm, including ritual, language, style of dress, is designed to encourage acts of self-denial. They believe in selfless actions and attaining peace through the elimination of selfishness, and by doing so, they choose to completely forget themselves and only serve others. You see this even in their initiation, as abnegation initiates, upon attaining membership, are forced to reject a life of vanity and self-indulgence, protecting themselves from greed and envy, which are considered also forms of selfishness. Things like gossiping, using the mirror for long periods of time, or often buying luxury items are forbidden. And again, when I first read these few values, I thought, okay, that's not completely horrible. We could use a little bit more of that in life, right? Let me continue. As abnegation members, the focus of their lives will be to serve others instead of themselves. Therefore, anything done for self-enjoyment is discouraged. Abnegation people also do not believe in kissing in public. Another one that baffled me is that children are not supposed to speak at the dinner table unless their parents ask them a direct question. They say their listening ears are a gift to their parents, and then after dinner, their parents give them the gift of their listening ears in the living room. Abnegation people cannot decorate their rooms. They see art as impractical, and they see that as time that could be serving others. Abnegation people do not form real friendships because it's hard to do so when no one feels that they can accept, help, or talk about themselves, because that to them would be too selfish. But one of the worst and the most controversial, I personally think, is that abnegation people view suicide as an act of selfishness, because someone who is truly selfless does not think of himself often to desire death. Another scary one is that guilt is used as a tool rather than a weapon against oneself. They use it to remind themselves to do better the next time. They don't celebrate birthdays because it would be self-indulgent. And most abnegation people do not speak up their mind and share their ideas in public because they deem it selfish to tell people what they think is right and get their way. Yeah. Those are only some of the abnegation values that I can manage to stomach to talk about today. And I know what you're going to say, Deborah, these factions are not meant to make sense anyway. They're exaggerated forms of personalities, and it's not meant to make sense, and it doesn't even matter towards the end of the book. I know, okay? But I need to get it out of my system. This needs to be discussed. Bear with me, okay? Bear with me. Let's get into my first point. Number 1. The extreme selflessness in abnegation might result in individuals becoming passive, submissive, and practically being a doormat. So, like I said, there's nothing wrong with wanting to incorporate a lot of selflessness in your life. In fact, in everyday life, I believe it's something that we should be actively working towards. But the problem is in abnegation is that their extremities and their rules can lead you to being a doormat. This is also something noted by other characters in the story. There are many characters that have noted abnegation members to be so passive. For example, in the book 4, Tobias has to do one of his mental simulation tests. And at the end of his test, when he incorporates Tris to be able to see his mind, he has to do that final part in which he has to shoot someone who looks like his mother or is his mother. And even though she's not wearing abnegation clothing, he says that she might as well be abnegation because only an abnegation person would rather stay still and have you shoot them than fight back. Basically, their whole entire image is being that of a doormat. And again, the image is not necessarily the problem. Being selfless and helping others is something to definitely be proud of, but doing it to the point where it's at your own detriment is not a badge of pride to wear on your chest. It also leaves you vulnerable to be preyed on by other human beings. Now, some people may argue that there's nothing wrong with being noble, as I've seen a lot of comments on different forums that are years old stating how living life as an abnegation would be such a noble thing to do. But I wholeheartedly disagree. I believe that there are elements of abnegation that could definitely be incorporated into one's life, but seeing this faction and idealizing it because of their quote-unquote nobleness is a huge mistake. As they say in Dauntless, there's a fine line between bravery and stupidity, and while it does take absolute bravery to be so selfless, abnegation's rules border on stupidity. Imagine not being able to share your own ideas and speak up in a class because it's deemed as too selfish. How is that supposed to help anybody? That in itself, I would argue, is selfish because you are actively hiding the best part of yourself that can actually contribute to other people's lives. Which leads into my final point. Abnegation is full of hypocrisy. The problem is that abnegation has a lot of hypocrisy within itself. They make this complete show about being selfless and not looking into mirrors and doing the most arbitrary things, but at the same time, they are very judgmental towards other factions. And because of their hypocrisy, it allows for people like Marcus, Tobias's father, to be able to exist and have power. He used to be seen as a great council leader because he embodied the quote-unquote values that were necessary to be a good abnegation. But on the inside, he was a sadistic, narcissistic, abusive father who abused his wife and his child. And one of the reasons that was able to even exist is because the way abnegation works, it does not value the actual core of selflessness and understanding, but rather values the show of it. With all the rules that abnegation as a faction has, if you were a kind and giving person who loved to wear clothes with different colors and love to put on makeup and do things that are quote unquote self-indulgent, but you spend your life helping people, in the eyes of abnegation, you would not be a good enough person because you do not put on the show of piety. You do not put on the show of self-sacrifice, which is exactly my problem. And I personally think that's one of the reasons that Marcus was able to exist and be a council leader for a long time, is because he knew how to put on a show of being a good abnegation leader, but he was a horrible person. You can argue that this is done in a lot of real life situations, in churches and also in cults. People will use the rules and the principles that are meant to be good things and make a show of it. And that is exactly what Marcus does. Now, I'm not going to say that every single person in abnegation was like this. Again, you have a bunch of innocent children who are just being brought up in the system. So I doubt that every single person in abnegation is like this. However, the environment that they foster allows for this kind of situation to happen. However, going back to what I was saying about Marcus and hypocrisy, I want to point out something that really shook me to the core about abnegation. So in the book 4, the book starts off in Tobias's childhood when he was living under his abusive father, Marcus. And what had happened was that Marcus told Tobias that his mother had died in childbirth, that they had seen her body and they had seen her ashes and that she was never coming back. It was super sudden and rushed, and even Tobias remembers seeing his mother before she eventually disappeared, but Marcus continued the charade. But the worst part is that it's not only Marcus that continued the charade, but also everybody else in Abnegation continued the charade with Marcus. When Four finally sees his mother again, she told him that she was not actually pregnant. She just wanted to leave Abnegation. Everybody who was in Abnegation, because remember, Marcus was a council leader, saw his wife. She was very active in the community. They knew she was not pregnant, and yet they still accepted Marcus's lie because they would rather accept the lie that someone died than the possible idea that someone could leave their faction. What also makes this worse is that these people actually held a funeral for Tobias's mother, knowing damn well that she wasn't dead, knowing well that she had left the faction and she became factionless. They came to Tobias's home and sat with him and told him that his mother had died and proceeded to coddle him and to continue a funeral in bereavement as if his mother had actually died. Like, imagine the trauma. Imagine. I'm sorry. How is that selfless in any regard? That in itself is one of the most alarming things I have ever heard. But I just wanted to present this to you because this was something that irked me to my core. And my final point, Abnegation versus Erudite, knowledge and curiosity. Each faction has beef with one another. So apparently Candor and Amity do not like each other as well, but Abnegation and Erudite are fierce haters of one another. Now, Erudite has its own problems, so I'll get into that a little bit later. But I do find it quite interesting that it is the faction that encourages curiosity and knowledge and wisdom that Abnegation hates because they consider curiosity as selfish. Because of the fact that Abnegation has some religious allegory, this is going to get a little bit left, and I don't talk about religion too much on this channel. However, I do find it interesting because there's a lot of religious allegory. Just to point out the further hypocrisy of this whole ideal in the group, I'm going to pull up something that I thought was important to note. I do see a lot of the parallels that Abnegation as a faction has with a lot of mega churches and a lot of institutions in real life. The clear abuse of power, and yet it is the same abuse of people that will be front and center leading a church. So I completely see where they're going with that. And I also think that can be argued with a lot of cult allegory as well. But if you guys know me on my channel, I like to use positive examples to counter negative examples. Because of the fact that Abnegation has a lot of religious undertones, I thought it would be appropriate to use at least a religious book that I'm personally familiar with to counter a lot of their arguments when it comes to selflessness and vanity. So in the Bible, we have the story of King Solomon, who is one of the most notorious figures in the Bible. Though King Solomon is a notoriously flawed person or character in the Bible who makes not the best of decisions, just like our Abnegation counterparts here. But the difference is that I want to use an example of how, despite his flaws as a person and some of the decisions he makes, he still understands the importance of wisdom, curiosity, and understanding, and the ideals of vanity and its placement in our lives. So King Solomon in the Bible was the son of King David that was before him. And basically, as he came into the throne, in the book of 1 Kings 3 verses 1 to 15, Solomon realizes that he is just a child and he truly does not know how to navigate the whole idea of being a king. And so what he does is that he asks God for wisdom. In verse 9, he says, in quote, "Give therefore thy servant an understanding heart to judge people, that I may discern between good and bad. For who is able to judge this thy so great a people?" King Solomon, as a result, does not ask for more riches and wealth, but he instead asks for wisdom. In verse 11, he says, "Because thou hast asked this thing, and hast not asked for thyself long life, neither hast asked for riches for thyself, nor hast asked the life for thine enemies, but hast asked for thyself understanding to discern judgment." In verse 13, he also says, "And I have also given thee that which thou hast not asked, both riches and honor, so that there shall not be among the kings like unto thee all thy days." Even God himself is impressed by Solomon's ability to set aside his need for riches and wealth and honor and glory and fame, and is able to place his heart in making sure that he's a good person and a good enough judge for his people. I bring this up as an example because Abnegation seems to focus on the ritualistic nature of living a noble life rather than understanding the core aspects of what it truly means to be a selfless person. That is what is missing in abnegation. A lot of people there are truly not selfless, but they are just following the rituals to look selfless to one another. If you compare this to how abnegation works, abnegation is also the main leaders of the council in the world of Divergent. And yet, despite being leaders overseeing harmony between 5 factions, they themselves cannot see the virtue and the value in true selflessness. Rather, they follow a ritualistic version of it instead and would rather prefer to continue virtual signaling. But I don't know, that's my personal opinion. Also, the fact that they discourage curiosity, whereas the religious allegory that it's trying to follow encourages curiosity, makes no sense to me. And it just proves to me that this is a faction that I truly dislike. But I don't know, did I go too far on this one? Am I reaching? Y'all tell me down in the comments below. I love hearing y'all's opinions. All over the internet, it seems that people really look up to abnegation as this noble way to live. And I'm like, are we seeing the same things or are we not seeing the same things? I will also be talking about other factions if you guys would like that. I remember when I first watched the films, I always knew on the inside that I would definitely identify with Candor. Like if I was in this situation, I would definitely be in Candor because there is no way I'm holding my mouth, as you guys can clearly see. Personally, for me, I would rather divulge all my secrets than have to do everything else everybody else does. So yeah, but that's just me. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching and I will see you guys in the next video. Also, Happy New Year, LOL. Okay, bye.